Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen. I'm the president of IGI Cyber Labs. We'll get started in just a minute in the first of our series around SMB cybersecurity thought leadership and how do we help SMB business leaders be better during these difficult times with all the ransomware attacks.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of the SMB Cybersecurity Thought Leaders Series. I am Krista Pusateri, Director of Business Development for Nodeware, an IGI Cyber Labs company. We are so excited to have you here today as we kick off this webinar series to really help educate small business owners, leaders, and practitioners as cyber threats are rising, ransomware is out there, and we have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and standards that we'll be talking about today with our experts, Chuck Brooks and Dr. Ron Ross. With that, I would love to pass along to Stuart Cohen, President of IGI Cyber Labs. Thank you for joining us, and please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and ask any questions in the Q&A as we move along to introducing our speakers and getting into a few housekeeping details. Stuart?
Krista, thank you very much. I joined IGI Cyber Labs and we made the announcement last week. And Chuck Brooks and Ron Ross and Todd Fitzgerald and Tony Sager and a number of us have been talking through how do we educate the small business leaders as to what's going on and what are some simple steps they can take to be better and smarter as it relates to all of the activities that are going on around ransomware and all the attacks on small businesses. And we came up with a series of these public service announcements that we are going to do with a wide variety of people. Please keep track of what we're doing, as it relates to what we're doing on social media. Chris, if you can advance the slide. Also, if you can watch on our website, you'll see us continue to announce additional presentations. We're going to have one from a hacker organization talking about how do they get into SMB environments. We're going to have one from the MIT Sloan School of Business around cybersecurity and some things they're seeing from business owners and board members and the like about what they are doing. We're going to have a conversation around how do small businesses get cyber insurance, how do they put it in place. And today and next week with Tony Sager from the Center of Information Security, we're going to be talking about how do you move towards compliance? How do you start to get your board and your investors and your C-suite comfortable with compliance? How do you take those first few steps? and what are the things you do with your MSP or MSSP or cloud provider to help you out. That was the concept behind what we have launched. We are thrilled to be able to have Chuck Brooks and Ron Ross on our session today to get started, to kick off this series that will take place over the course of the next few months. And just as Krista said, please submit your questions in the question box, and we'll make sure we get to some of your questions, and we will follow up with all of you on the questions that you asked that we didn't get to. So with that, I am thrilled to have two of the great industry thought leaders around cybersecurity in Chuck Brooks and Ron Ross, and I will turn it over to them to get started.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Krista. It's a pleasure for us to be here. I'm looking forward to this. As you mentioned, small business and medium business are the core of our economy. This is really important that we understand the implications for cybersecurity and what's out there, the resources we have. And there's no one better than Dr. Ron Ross who can set the strategy and frameworks for this. And it's my pleasure to be able to be here with him. Before we do that, I'd like to sort of start and give you a quick overview of some of the ransomware realities we're facing, because until recently, most of us sort of ignored ransomware. It's been around for many years, but we haven't really looked at what the implications are until it started affecting us at the gas line with the Colonial Pipeline hack and in the meats with J&J and other things. But it's been happening, and it's been happening more often. But a quick overview of some of these stats, which I'm sure the slides will be available to afterwards, is that in last year, their ransomware attacks were up over 150% over the previous year. And the amount paid by victims of these attacks increased to more than 300% in that year too. So research found these malicious emails spend an average of 83 hours in an employee's inbox before he noticed. So you can imagine all that time and ability to do lateral things within a company, particularly within a small business, without being discovered, and the implications of stealing your critical data. Recently, FBI Director Christopher Wray said that the agency, FBI, is now investigating about 100 different types of ransomware, and there are different ransomware families that use different points of entry, such as file sharing networks, very common, mail advertising, phishing, still perhaps the most easiest way to breach a company, email attachments, malicious links, and infected systems to scan for vulnerable open ports and internet connected computers, now being aided by a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies. So ransomware has been active, an ongoing malware threat since actually long before 2013, but the 2013 was sort of a wake-up cry with WannaCry, Petgen, and that basically went through 100 countries and a lot of healthcare facilities, and it was one of the biggest high-profile ransomware attacks. Colonial Pipeline just a few weeks ago just confirmed that it paid $4.4 million to the gang of hackers who broke into its computer systems. So you're seeing now the ability of hackers to exfiltrate not only data, but exfiltrate money, largely through cryptocurrency. So attacks are focusing on taking information, the more sensitive, the better. And these threat actors are often highly organized criminal organizations who understand not only just the ability to steal things, but the company's financial picture, the industry in which they're operating, and how to exploit the company to maximum effective leverage so that they would pay ransom. So last year alone, the U.S. ransomware gangs hit more than 100 federal, state, and municipal agencies, upward to 500 healthcare centers and hospitals, and 1,680 education institutions, and untold thousands of businesses, most of those being small and medium-sized businesses. Next slide, please. So you're seeing incongruent with a lot of these activities with ransomware. You've heard a lot of action on the Hill recently, executive orders, and there's good reason, because the spending now in cybersecurity is almost $133 billion, or $134 billion aimed for next year. And cybercrime is estimated now to be costing the world economy about $6 trillion. So there's a imperative now it's more than an imperative, it's a big wake-up call for companies and governments to get their act together and focus on what is the biggest threat nowadays, is our connectivity and cybersecurity. So the threat actors, there's a lot of them, especially state-sponsored ones and criminal enterprises. They're taking advantage of this expanding cyber attack surface by, largely induced by COVID-19 and on the work from home. employment ecosystem. And we're finding that these attacks are becoming now even more sophisticated. They're automating their attacks through machine intelligence, and they're using shared tools that they ultimately share in dark web forums. And there's also a lot more collaboration among some of these criminal enterprises as it's become a lucrative field. So there are a lot of different things that need to be enacted in a cybersecurity trend and strategy, and there's a lot of talk, and Ron will go in more detail on some of this. And these are all linked, of course. Zero trust, supply chain security management, enhanced mobility, data interoperability, and those are top goals of DHS, and they're also coordinated heavily with NIST. And then you have other factors that are now impacting the landscape, new technologies, emerging technologies such as mobility, Internet of Things, 5G, and a move to cloud and edge computing. Bringing really operational shifts and they're driving new security requirements and advances in security that continue to be needed, particularly with analytics and monitoring all these different companies being affected. Next slide, please. This is really the gold standard, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and this is sort of everything is based from this. Ron will, of course, go into more detail on this, but I think the beauty of this framework is it can expand in other verticals and then be customized. The focus is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Next slide, please. And specifically what we're talking about today is the new NIST ransomware framework. It's a very in-depth analysis and practical, and there's advice that Ron will go into related to the use of what you should do, how you use antivirus software, how you keep computers fully patched, and what you do with security upgrades, the use of various security products and services to block known ransomware sites, and how you configure operating systems and use third-party software, and how you restrict and prohibit the use of personally owned devices, a huge challenge, of course, in our work-from-home environment. So they're going to be a lot of different advice, and I'm going to skip this last part because I think Ron has more pertinent and personal advice that he will provide in his introduction. But the important thing here is that, and I'm very happy to say that NIST has been very agile in reacting to the newer threat, the growing threat, because of the sophistication and the automation of these ransomware attacks and the implications they're having for taking out critical infrastructure, and they're targeting a small business, particularly in the healthcare field. So I think, next slide, please. I want to leave you with this resources that are put together for NIST, which is really the go-to if you have any questions regarding any kind of tips for dealing with ransomware, fact sheets, framework profiles, and customized also for various verticals in different businesses. So I urge you to use these resources. They're free. They're available through the government, through NIST, and they're the standards being used throughout government and most of industry. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking a lot about how to be operational in a small business scenario. And so at this point, I'd like to relay the conversation to Ron, who could give you an introduction of really what the NIST framework means for ransomware, how they came about developing it, and where it could be applied. And so Ron, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Chuck. I appreciate it. And thank you to Stuart and Krista for bringing this series to all of our customers out there. I think cybersecurity education is really one of the most important things we can do today, because these are enormously challenging and difficult problems to solve, and we're not going to be able to do it individually. So this kind of collaboration is essential. I also wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues at NIST. I'm not actually the subject matter expert on the small business outreach. We have a whole program, and the resources that Chuck just displayed there a moment ago. Nelson Hastings and Marion Merritt, the two leaders at NIST who are running the small business outreach program. And we're not going to be able to cover everything in an hour webinar today. So the goal here is to try to just get your arms around this big problem, give you the resources that can be helpful to you as you build and improve your cybersecurity programs, and talk about a few details on things that you can do that don't cost a lot of money. They're not hard to do, but they do take planning. And so I just want to start and kind of frame the overall ransomware problem. Chuck talked about the kind of the very functional nature of our systems today. We're building an incredible capability in these complex systems and networks today that we are seeing rolling out. They're innovative. They're giving us greater capabilities than we've ever had before. But the downside of that is that all of that complexity, and we're talking about trillions of lines of code and billions of devices, and with the Internet of Things and all the things coming together now, that represents what we call attack surface. And what that really means is those are the places that the adversaries, the bad guys, the hackers, can get into your systems. And so for the past 30 years, our strategy has been build that wall as high as you can build it, stop them at the front door if you can, and then hope for the best. But we've seen now in the last couple of years, especially with these very sophisticated cyber attacks and the ransomware attacks, that many times if we don't do the fundamental blocking and tackling, I like to use that analogy, a football analogy, blocking and tackling, the basics, to implement the safeguards that are necessary to keep the adversaries out, keep them from coming in the house at all. But to be honest, they're using very sophisticated attack tools. So even when we do everything we know we should do, sometimes they're going to get in. And so the strategy that we're pushing now, and this is reflected in the cybersecurity framework and all the other things we're doing at NIST, is the first dimension is stop them at the front door if you can. And everything we're talking about today, all this guidance on the NIST website is going to help you establish those fundamental safeguards, whether it's two-factor authentication, strong access controls, encrypting data at rest, having good backup plans and strategies. All of those things are things that are contained in all the website links that are on the screen here today. But if you can't always stop them, then the second dimension is limiting the damage they can do once they're inside. And that happens a lot today. You've seen some of these very high-end attacks like SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, where the adversaries, they get in to the system. They usually compromise something very simple, what we call low-hanging fruit, a single credential. And then they'll do privilege escalation until they look like an insider then, and they can do almost anything they want. And so that's where the whole ransomware story starts, is once they're on the inside, they can do things that they shouldn't be doing and can cause great damage and destruction. Ultimately, the third dimension is having a system that we call cyber or system resilient, which means even if you're getting attacked and you have these things going on, a ransomware attack in particular, it doesn't bring down your business or the mission capability that your organization is trying to pursue. And so those are the three dimensions, and everything we're going to talk about today is going to contribute to those three dimensions. So I think at the outset, we just look at this from a 30,000-foot view. I wrote down kind of 4 simple steps that I would take if I'm looking at how do I start this from ground zero. I mean, a lot of small business out there, they're busy doing their jobs, their business. It's hard to run a small business or even a medium-sized business today, especially during the COVID time. So you have a lot of pressures out there to run the business. And so, the cybersecurity stuff, it has to get done, but we're going to try to make it as easy as possible so you can be successful. The first thing I think that is important is to understand and know your assets. Those could be information assets, critical data, things that your business has to have to operate, customer information, the secret sauce, whatever those critical information assets are. The other assets that are important to understand and to document are your assets on the network. All of the systems, the system components, the applications, the operating systems, all of those pieces that form the system, you have to understand what you have and where it's located on the network, because as you start to develop your protection strategy, there's going to be some things we're going to talk about today that will require you to understand criticality of assets and what all you have on the network and in your information inventory. Then once, and we do have, by the way, we have a FIPS standard called FIPS 199 that is we call it the impact standard. It helps you categorize all of your assets, your information, your systems, is either low impact, moderate impact, or high impact, where impact is impact to the business if those assets are stolen or compromised in some way, and it affects your ability to do business. After you know your assets, then the next thing is to do some planning. I think it's necessary to plan in two areas. You've got to plan on how you're going to organize your system. We call that the architecture of the system. And there's some things that I'm sure Chuck and I will be talking about later that have to do with least functionality, least privilege, limiting the number of applications that are run on the system, trying to limit the number of devices that you have to deal with. But there's also the planning on what happens, how do I protect my information, and how do I make sure I back it up safely and put it in a secure location so the adversaries can't get to it. That's part of an additional planning scheme that you'll go through that has to do with your incident response plan and disaster recovery plan, planning for the time when there is that attack and you have to come back to business as usual in the best way you can. And so the example I like to use in that regard is your house. You know, we all have locks on our front doors, but if the bad guys get through the lock on the front door and they come into your house, can they go into any room and rip off all your valuables? Or what if you have a lock, a safe or a vault in every room in your house? And so we talk about these as security domains, which means that everything in your system is not equally accessible. You're going to hear a lot of things in the upcoming weeks and months about zero trust architecture, zero trust concepts. It's really nothing more than the vault and the safe. You try to separate the critical assets into places that are harder to get to by the adversary. And that's certainly kind of the core of the protection strategy for the ransomware attacks. Backing up your information and putting it in an offline location, air gap, so they can't get to it, even if they come in that front door. That's kind of the overall objective that we're trying to achieve. I think when you have all the planning done and you want to start to go build your new environment with those safeguards, it's really important to make a fundamental assumption. I would always assume that the adversaries are already in my system, that it's already been compromised. And of course, we'll talk about the 1,000 different ways that can happen with clicking on links and opening up attachments. Many times, the adversary will be hiding in your system. They don't always rear their heads right away. They may wait, and that malicious code can be there for months or even years. And so I believe it's important when you're putting in the safeguards to start with a clean environment, which means starting with a clean operating system. The latest software is always the best bet. The latest operating system, which has all of the vulnerabilities that have been patched, and now you get new functionality, better security functionality. Applications, keeping those up to date and all of those patched, but make sure that you have the latest and a clean environment to start with, because you don't want to be building an environment and putting in safeguards when you've already got the adversary lurking in your operating system or somewhere that you can't see. So that clean environment is very important. And then after that, then you just have to go and establish the safeguards that are necessary. And that's where the cyber security framework and all the tools that Chuck showed on the NIST resource list come into play. The cybersecurity framework is a way to get your arms around a difficult and challenging problem. And if you look at the framework and its simplicity is just amazing, because it starts out with top-level functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And so when you go reflect on what I was talking about now about coming up with a strategy and doing planning, a lot of that is in the identify step. That's where you're looking at what kind of assets do I have? How valuable are they? How critical are they? What things are on my network? What kind of applications am I running? And once you have all that planning done and under the identify step, then you can move into the next step, the protect step. And that's the place where you'll start talking about some of the technologies where we talk about strong identity and access management, access controls, information flow controls. And that gets into the discussion of privileges and privilege management, making sure that you don't have everybody have access to administrative privileges. Giving people too many privileges can result in a lot of bad things happening. That's where the least privilege term comes from in cybersecurity. And that leads us to a discussion on least functionality. We talked about complexity, and how all these applications that we're bringing in and all the things, that complexity is where the adversary lives and hides. And it's really important that you try to limit and manage that complexity. And one of the terms that you'll see is the notion of only bringing components. When I talk about that, could be applications, middleware, anything you bring into the system of the network. Limit those things to only things that are mission essential. There's a lot of applications that get brought into your organization, especially businesses. And now during COVID, when there's a lot of connectivity with home computers and things that going on at home, and there could be things going on your home computer, and then you hook that up to the network at the business, and that just creates a pipeline for malicious code to infect. So it's important to limit the number of functions, ports, protocols, applications to only those that are mission essential. And that's hard to do because people want to load up their devices with applications. That's human nature. So you have to fight that because, you know, we have a lot of data now. 90% of these attacks are coming in from the web and email. And so things like opening up an email attachment or clicking on a link, which is very common today. Sometimes we're pretty sloppy because we're busy. We have a lot of things going on. But even at NIST, when I get an email with an attachment, I will, out of band, I will either call the individual or I will send them an email in a separate thread to confirm that they actually sent me that attachment before I'll open it up. And in addition to that, we have technology that's scanning anything coming in over the internet is being scanned for malicious code. I also don't like clicking on links all that much. We're forced to do it, and we do it a lot. But many of these ransomware attacks are coming in from clicking on these links or from people wandering out to websites harmlessly. When you go to a website, it could be a perfectly legitimate website that's also been attacked by an adversary. The malicious code is in that what you consider a safe website, and just by hitting that site, you're bringing that malicious code right back down into your system and your network. So these are some of the things that I think frame the kind of the 30,000 foot level. And I think I'm going to stop here and turn it back over to Chuck, because I could talk all day on this. And I want to make sure the audience has time for Q&A, and also make sure you come to the NIST website. We have a lot of great folks who are just willing to help. You're our customers, you pay our salaries, so take advantage of our resources, please.
Great,
Hey,
great insights. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, Chuck, I was just going to ask you and Ron one question. You know, we have so many small businesses that don't have an IT person or a full-time IT person, and the CFO, the COO, the CEO, you know, they're worried about the continuity of their business going forward. They're worried about the confidentiality of their data. They're worried about the integrity of their systems, because that's how they survive, that's how they grow, that's how they communicate with their customers. Could you guys maybe spend a minute on what a C-level executive that is not associated with IT, you know, might be able to do, take a few steps, take a few minutes, provide a little bit of leadership and education that helps with some of the business issues that come from these cyber attacks?
Sure. Well, you know, as Ron alluded, cybersecurity is not just an IT issue. It's a people issue. It's a leadership issue. And I think it's imperative for the C-suite to at least understand the various threat levels and implications, particularly for their own business, if something does happen and does get breached. And that's why I really like the focus of this recent NIST ransomware, because it focuses on resiliency. Expect that you're going to be attacked. And with that, you have to have a strategy. And you know, you're right. There's a lot of these small companies don't have the budgets, but there's abilities to use managed service. There are plenty of firms out there that could provide firms. There's monitoring capabilities and software, and even encryption. There's basic encryption packages. I think the bottom line is you don't want to make yourself an easy target. And the more you put in front of you, and the more you follow cybersecurity hygiene, and you instruct your employees to follow that hygiene, and you keep the network segmented and personal devices segment, you can really control, you know, they're going to go for the low-hanging fruit, and you can control your destiny. You're not totally invulnerable, and there's still a likelihood you could be hacked, or you could be in the system, like Ron said. But there are things that the C-suite can do and should do, and I think that is really what NIST is promoting, strategy. And the strategy is adaptable from the top down and from the bottom up. So I think, there's plenty of information in there to use to pick and choose of what may be specifically customizable to your own vertical and business mission that you need to do. It may not be procuring all the antivirus software, but it may be other things. It may be having a blockchain. It may be having multi-factor authentication. A lot of different things you can do. Ron, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, we kind of live in a bubble. When a lot of the big businesses and in the government, we have the luxury of having huge cybersecurity staffs and a lot of resources to help address these challenges. But in a small business world, they probably don't even have a C-suite in some cases. They're and as you said, they're the chief cook and bottle washer. They have to do it all. And so I'm a big believer in taking advantage when you can't provide that expertise and that skills within your own facilities on premise. Take advantage of some of our great managed service providers and cloud service providers. But I would say this, you have to, I don't trust anybody. I would say that you got to trust but verify. Everything that you're learning on this webinar today, you can make notes and take down all of the things that you think you would be doing if it were you were doing it yourself, and then make that list for your managed service provider and say, hey, are you doing A, B, C, D? Kind of hold their feet to the fire, check to see what their security program looks like, because that is your data ultimately. And in the federal government, even when we used outside providers, we are responsible for that. We have the risk. The risk still resides with us. We're the ultimate risk takers, just like you are. So when you're sending your critical information to a managed service provider or one of the big cloud providers, make sure you challenge them and say, these are the things that I expect you to do to protect my data. Now, what are you doing? And then take a look. And it's a trade decision. You have to decide. It's a risk-based decision. And I think a lot of times that may be the best way for our small businesses to get that kind of protection. We're seeing some of that in the DoD now with the CMMC program, where we have a lot of small businesses that are trying to support the DoD, and we have a lot of requirements in that CMMC program. So it's a really big problem, Chuck, as you said, because our economy really rolls on small and mid-sized businesses, and so that's where a lot of the intellectual property and all the innovation and a lot of that energy is coming from to drive the economy. So I think it's critical that we try everything we can do to help our small and medium-sized businesses be successful. And I think that would be one way to solve that resource problem at the local level.
So I think what you're also saying is that visibility is really a critical area particularly for these small businesses. And there are a lot of ways to get better visibility into your own networks, particularly if you're not an expert in IT. And to take advantage of those managed services and those programs and software out there is probably something that everyone should consider as a small business. And I also think that there's a lot of opportunity now for collaboration. Public-private partnerships are really becoming more and more important, particularly with the attacks on critical infrastructure. And a lot of the lessons learned now and how they're doing this and how they're getting in, particularly with ransomware, it translates down to the small and medium business level. So I think that, collectively, if government and state and local government, federal government, tribal and small business, medium business, and large business work closer together and share lessons learned and share intelligence, we'd be a much more formidable position to prevent breaches.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think that you mentioned before the trust issues and all that, and transparency. I think a lot of the times it's hard to trust unless you have transparency. And that's why, for example, the FedRAMP program, when that program started over a decade ago, we worked with the folks at GSA and also at OMB in establishing that cloud program at GSA. All the requirements were well known, all the security controls were published, and then the cloud providers go through a fairly detailed assessment to make sure all those controls are in place, operating as intended, and supporting whatever their security policy is. And that's all documented. That's evidence that helps customers be able to come to that cloud offering, whether it's software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service, and have confidence that providers are doing their due diligence. So, and you could make that same argument for any provider, managed service provider. It's that transparency. So the customers get back to something that's very important. They have to have assurance that you're protecting their stuff. And that can only come with greater transparency. I don't think we have enough of that today. It's kind of like the black box. I just kind of shove stuff in and I hope for the best. And that's not a good solution for most customers.
A question for you. I mean, we saw with the COVID-19 a rash of ransomware attacks and malware targeted at hospitals, healthcare, research institutions, life sciences. Are you working closely at NIST with I guess the healthcare community? It has been a really a problematic area for cybersecurity, largely because what you said, they don't have the budgets or the expertise. Is there a outreach and cooperation in that area?
Was that one for me, Chuck, or was that for Stuart?
That was for you, yes.
For me, okay. Yes, so we have two different divisions at NIST. One is the Computer Security Division, where I live and work. And then there's the Applied Cybersecurity Division. That's where actually the National Cyber Center of Excellence is, and all the outreach. And that's more addressing what I would call the vertical sectors, healthcare being one of those, financial services. And that's where, and the NCC, that's where a lot of those profiles are developed. Now, we do have a lot of interaction with the healthcare industry. The NCC, we did a profile not too long ago on medical devices, which used the cybersecurity framework and actually created a profile so you could have greater assurance in a medical device, that like an infusion pump, for example. So yes, we work with every sector. The healthcare sector is critical because it's a large part of our economy as well. And but we also do a lot of work with the financial services sector, and we work with the DoD and the intelligence community. So the good news is that all these customers out there have basically the same problem. They're using computers and technology to support their critical missions and business applications. They are totally dependent on that technology, and much of the software and the things we use, I won't say it's untrustworthy, but let's say there's an unknown degree of trustworthiness in a lot of the things we use. So we have to do a lot better in that regard, and there's just a lot of people out there who can use our help.
Hey, Ron, we got a couple of questions that I wanted to address. First of all,
Sure.
we did get asked if this is going to be recorded. It will be recorded, and we can make the recording available to people who want it. Please feel free to put in questions in the question box, as we said. You know, we did get one specifically around how SMBs that might not have an IT department or might have a part-time IT department, how do those executives begin to eliminate or reduce their cybersecurity complexity? And what are the first few steps they take?
Chuck, do you want to take that, or me to take that one? Well, I think you can take that. I was going to say into the 4 steps you mentioned, with that sort of is a framework for that. But go ahead.
Well, the steps are actually pretty simple, and they don't always cost a lot of money, but they do take some attention to detail. I think just the basics, understanding your assets and being able to reduce that complexity. So you have to start out by being fairly hard-lined about getting rid of all the unnecessary applications and data that's just sitting around that you don't need or is outdated. It's kind of like a spring house cleaning, going through and simplifying. Simple is always better when it comes to cybersecurity, because complexity it makes it very hard for us to understand always what we have and how it's being implemented, how all those interactions are taking place. So that's the first thing I think you could do. And then the second thing is just to identify your critical assets. Every organization, whether it's NIST or DHS or a Bank of America, whatever the company is, they all have critical assets. Identifying those very quickly, and it sounds easy to do, but a lot of times people have so much data, they have to think about that for a while. And use our FIPS 199, because once you identify that critical data, then you can start to take the steps we talked about earlier. For example, making sure that you have multi-factor authentication, 2-factor. And this is not something that's as hard as using the PIV cards used to be in the federal government or the DoD CAT cards. There are a lot of 2-factor solutions out there that are provided by a lot of the mainstream vendors out there. So multi-factor, about half of the successful cyber attacks start with the compromise of a single credential, a password, and they're not using multi-factor. So if you can cut out half of those attacks by doing one simple thing, then that's what you should be doing. The other thing is identifying safe backup locations. So once you have those critical assets identified, then you've got to have that plan to make sure that you know how you're going to back up those resources, where that backup data is going to go, and if it's still accessible over the network. So one of the things that happens once ransomware is resident in your system, it's going to spread like wildfire. And so, one of the first things that they'll tell you when that attack happens is disconnect from the network. Take all the Ethernet cables out. Get off of Wi-Fi, and then take all the devices, disable all the devices that are connected. So there's a lot of things that you can do. And again, we talked about least functionality, least privilege. Going through and looking at every one of your employees and what kind of privileges they have when they're on the network or the system. Again, a lot of times people give people access to way too many privileges, and it's not that they're doing bad things, but you should limit the really least privilege means only giving people privileges that are necessary to carry out your specific role within the organization. And a lot of times privileges are just given out way too easily. So those are just a couple of things. And testing your backups. A lot of times people put a backup system in place and they never test it. And then when the ransomware attack happens, they find, well, they thought they did the backup, but all the data didn't get where it was supposed to go. Only some of it. When they try to recover it, they can't get it back to the way it was when they sent it over. And so I think that testing of that is really critical. And again, making sure that this is not just a tech problem. We've kind of outsourced cybersecurity to the IT, the tech side of the house. This is a holistic, all hands on deck problem. And these holistic solutions are going to involve people, processes, procedures, and technology all working together. And that has to be orchestrated not by the CIO or the CISO. Many small businesses don't even have CISOs. It has to be orchestrated by whoever owns the business, because at the end of the day, when the tech fails and the ransomware attack occurs, that may be the death knell of the business. They may not be able to come back. And we have this notion that, hey, anybody can absorb an attack. It's hard enough to run a small business without cyber attacks today. But if you combine that difficulty of just starting and running a small business with the cyber attacks, it makes it almost impossible. That's why we desperately need to have these simple measures put into place, and the senior leadership of the small business, mid-sized business being actively involved, because that involves signing checks, resources, paying for protection that you need to help reduce your susceptibility. You see, I don't say prevent cyber attacks, I say reduce susceptibility, because there's no perfect security today, but you can do a lot to really minimize them getting in. And if they do get in, you can minimize the damage they can do.
Chuck, I wanted to add something on a question that, we see all sorts of attacks and information, people coming in during normal business hours when people working remote in a hybrid environment, with all the issues that go on during a normal business day versus at nights and on the weekends. And it just leads to one of the questions somebody got, how do SMBs do a better job to manage their attack surface? Or how do they, start to make plans in place to reduce it? And how do you put the request on your MSPs or MSSPs to do that for you?
Yeah, well, it's not an easy challenge. You're right. I would say that, it starts probably, if you're a small business, with doing a vulnerability assessment. It goes back to what Ron said about knowing your assets, where they stand, how vulnerable they are. And so you have a metric to measure. And you want to make sure every day you go in, or every week, that you see that those assets and data are protected, that nothing's changed, that there has been no changes physically, insider threats, that someone that may have left a computer unattended, or there's a back door from an administrator who has access. And you need to be continually monitoring and reviewing them to see who has this access. It is not an expensive endeavor. I mean, these are basic things you could do. And if you want to go even further, you could do random penetration test to see if there has been someone that has penetrated through an application. But again, I really go with the whole mantra that keep it simple. You know, just really know the vital strategy, know what you want to achieve, know what you want to protect. Look at it holistically, as Ron said. You know that you're not invulnerable. You're likely you're going to get hacked, but you want to reduce the implications for your business if you are, and have an incident response plan ready if something does happen. And that, of course, requires a strong, backed up and tested data.
You know, Stuart and Chuck, also just patching your operating system, that doesn't take a lot of resources. It takes time, obviously, to someone to do that, but that simple step, because the big vendors out there, they are keeping up. They have a lot of people who do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They design the systems, they maintain those systems. And let's face it, with large and complex software and systems, which an operating system may have 70 or 80 million lines of code, you're going to have things that pop up. There are weaknesses and deficiencies that just don't get wrung out during the development process. When they find them, they broadcast them, and they expect you to patch those quickly, because once those are announced publicly, then the clock starts. The adversary gets that notice the same time you do. The question is, who's going to be quickest? Are they going to be able to attack your system and that vulnerability and exploit that vulnerability before you patch, or are you going to be quicker? That's why it's important that you do it very quickly and often, and pay attention. And that goes for applications too. And just modernizing your systems. And I know that sounds easy for, you know, big businesses and some of the federal agencies, maybe not so easy, but for small businesses, it's really tough, because putting in new stuff costs money. And they're balancing that with running on very small margins in some of the small businesses. So, but when the time comes, you can really gain a lot of benefit by going to the next generation of technology, operating systems, of the applications, because they've been going through that improvement process, continuous improvement, all the way through. And so that will help wring out some of those previous nagging vulnerabilities that have been there forever.
And Chuck, we also got a question about backups, and what are the best type of backups that should be put in place? How do you do that? How do you leverage your MSP or your MSSP to provide the right kind of backups and right kind of support to help you run your business?
Yeah. Well, again, there's a lot of resources. I wouldn't recommend one product, but there are a lot of good products out there.
I was looking for a product.
Yeah, but backups. There's several ways. One, of course, if you're using a cloud provider, they can do that for you. And managed service providers are excellent at that. It could be a hybrid situation with a hybrid cloud. You could also work with others in a shared data system, where you can develop your own encryption backup. There's encryption programs available, some stronger than others. I'd recommend using encryption in every case, but there's no reason to back off, and also have it backed off at a different prem, not on a prem, having a different location for your data. There's basically so many options, which is a good thing. So I think for small businesses, it's really important for them to explore that, as part of their strategy and part of their framework. I think they need to look at, okay, what makes sense for us, and where should we back it up? Are we going to use a cloud? Are we going to use a hybrid cloud? Are we going to keep it on prem? It's going to be encrypted. A lot of different things to consider.
Yeah, the other thing about backups too is it's important. This is an architecture issue. Make sure those encryption keys are not stored where they're accessible, because it's like locking your front door and putting the keys under the front mat. That you got to make sure that all of these aspects are attended to, because the adversaries are pretty smart. They understand a lot about our architecture. They really sometimes understand our systems better than we do, and so it's really important that you take that architectural perspective on this problem when you're going through and establishing all your safeguards.
We just put a poll up about managed services just to get a feel from our audience of the number of people that are using a managed service provider or an MSSP versus ones that are doing it themselves. So if you get a chance, if you could fill out the poll question, we would appreciate that. And then I think, once again, I'd like to go back to, what are the first couple of steps an executive could do with their employee base to start to educate them that this is not an IT problem, that it is specifically, an all employee problem, and it's a leadership issue.
I could jump in quickly on that. Again, I think training is important, particularly anti-phishing training, which is a common way of ensnaring employees, and also basic cyber hygiene. How to lock up your devices, where to take them, not to mix, cross-pollinate your personal with your work devices. All that needs to be reinforced on a regular basis, and gamification sometimes helps that too. Really important things to do. And so I think, it starts from the top, and setting an example as a CEO or a VP or any kind of a C-suite executive is really the way to start. And, I think it's, easily they could power a NIST framework to basically cultivate and develop a personalized approach to their business, and should. And so that's where I would start.
Yeah, I agree with Chuck on that one. I think that there's really two ways that a CEO or the head of the small business can do that. Certainly, education, training, and awareness. We have a whole lot of material on that, just that aspect alone. But just having the head of the organization, the head of the business, saying, hey, this is important to me, and here's what phishing attacks can do to us. Here's what opening up an attachment or a malicious link can do to our business. And it personalizes it. It says, that we could lose our business because of one person clicking on one link, and illustrate what can happen with that type of an attack. And I think that will bring it home to every employee there. And we're trying to create that team environment where every person in that team is valued and know they have a part in the success of the business. And that includes what they do and don't do with regard to cybersecurity. And then the other half of that conversation that the senior leaders would have to have is with the people who are actually within the organization doing the detailed work of the cybersecurity program. And it may turn out that that's nobody, because if the business is that small, they may have to go to the MS managed service provider. Or they could have a small staff that is working together to bring that security program up to code and make it effective. And that conversation, again, will reinforce from the senior leaders' perspective, hey, this team, they're cybersecurity folks, but they're not sitting in a silo down the hall. They are a part of everything we do in the organization. I think that's one of the things that's held us back in cybersecurity is we have siloed cybersecurity, and we've kind of cordoned it off into the room down the hall, the security team, when in reality, and we put it in the tech area under the CIO, when in reality, it's part of everything we do in the organization. And we have to get it out of that silo and make it part of everybody's job every day, so they understand what they have to do and how to do it, and work together as a team, working toward one goal, protecting the business.
I'd just like to add that I think having a siloed IT is also a risk in itself, because you have so much turnover of people, and they leave often with leaving administrative privileges open, expertise in the background. So it really is, what Ron just said, you really has to be a whole of company approach to cybersecurity and not rely solely on IT. There's vulnerabilities there, and I think it needs to be multidimensional, and you have to have, just like when you're doing your planning, you have to have backup to see if someone leaves, who the next person takes over, how they're trained, what they know already. So it's really a much broader perspective.
So thanks so much for filling out the first poll question. We have another poll question that's coming up specifically around multi-factor authentication, which I thought you made some great points as to how you can educate your employees, as well as how many people have done a vulnerability management scan. While that poll is coming up, I just want to remind people, this is the first in a series of presentations and public service announcements that we're going to do. So feel free to go back to our website. If there are topics, if there are speakers you'd like to hear from, please let us know that. Do the same thing over LinkedIn. We'd be very interested in hearing, kind of what you have to say about that. Also, while you're filling out the poll question, I think it would be, I think I'd like to go back to the managed service provider question. And are people, and how do you transition from, what is desktop support that a lot of organizations have in place that don't have an IT team? How do you transition to a MSP? And what are some ways, as it relates to the NIST framework, you ought to think about the first few steps you should take?
Well, I can jump in on that really quickly. I think just like anything else, you need to interview the companies. There are a lot of quality managed service providers out there, depending upon your needs. Some are more geared towards larger companies and have more of a cloud-based approach. And some others are just sort of hands-on that have a local cybersecurity expertise. That may be what you need for a small business. That may be perfect. Maybe in a retail, whether it's something you're doing as your own business, or it could be related to your vertical, if it's in healthcare, education, transportation, whatever. So I would look for experience in those and get basically references from their clients, just like you would with any other person you're hiring, whether it be a landscaper or a carpenter. I think you need to look at what your needs are, what your budget is, and how they can best provide the best bang for the buck.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I love the interview concept. I would actually go to one of the links that we provided today. It's called Tips and Tactics for Preventing Ransomware. There's a list of about a dozen things there. I would screenshot that or print it off, and I would take that with me to the interview. And I would interview multiple companies and ask them, are they doing these things? And that's the first question. The second one is, how do we know you're doing these things? Have you had an independent third-party assessment that can verify that you're using antivirus software, you have a backup plan, and you're doing everything that I would be doing in my organization? You have the Cybersecurity Framework draft profile now on the website, and that, again, if you go to the last column where you have the functions, categories, subcategories, controls, those controls, by the way, come out of NIST 853, and I believe also the ISO 27001 international standard if you're doing business internationally. But that last column in that framework profile has the ransomware connection, if you will, because the rest of the framework profile is pretty boilerplate, standard stuff. But what Kurt Barker, the author, did is he then personalized it for ransomware in that last column. That can provide you a lot of good information that you can take into that interview if you're going to go to that MSP and consider moving your critical data to that environment, or a cloud provider, or any external provider. Again, the customer should be the one in charge, and it's your dollars. You're spending money out there at that MSP. It's just like at NIST. We consider all of you our customers. We work for you, and we would expect you to come to us with your requirements, and then we do our best to produce the best standards and guidelines. It's the same thing. Customer needs to be driving the train here.
Ron, thanks so much. This is terrific. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. We'll probably have you back with some of the SMB team from NIST as well on the next session. Chuck, I don't know if you have a couple of comments you wanted to make in closing, and then I will wrap this up and we will close.
Yeah, I think, I learned something. I think the value here is that the cybersecurity is a learning process. And the more you discuss it, the more you talk about the various threats and challenges, the tools that are available, and the policies and frameworks out there, the better equipped you're going to be to prevent or help prevent a breach. So I think, I learned myself from hearing a lot about what's happening, and I'm excited to be a part of this, and I thought it was a very informative session, and look forward to hearing more.
Hey, both of you, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time. You can see on the slide, we've got the next one coming up next week with Todd Fitzgerald and with Tony Sager from the Center for Internet Security. We'd be thrilled to have you participate on that session. We'll keep you informed. Keep connected with us on LinkedIn. Come to our website. As I said, if there's topics or speakers that you'd like to hear about, we'd like to know that. We want to put together a series of these public service announcements, if you will, and how we help SMBs be better, smarter, and safer. We're looking at things like the White House letter to corporate executives and business leaders and how do SMBs implement that, as well as a variety of other things. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today. I appreciate your participation in the polls and in the Q&A. And we'll look forward to seeing you all on next week's session, once again with Todd Fitzgerald and Tony Sager. Thank you for your time, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, everyone. And please do join us in LinkedIn for the next event and ask any questions that you like there as well. We'll see you next week.